Welcome everybody. My name's Simon Schretter. I'm the Secretary of St John's College Climate Crisis Committee, which is responsible for this event. We think it's the first time a college in either Cambridge or Oxford has had a climate crisis lecture. Sadly, we don't think it'll be the last one. And in fact, we would hope to establish this as the first of a series. I'm going to hand over shortly to our master to introduce our main speaker, and then I will pop up again when we move to Q&A and things like that. Okay, thank you.
Simon, thank you very much, and I add my warm welcome to you all for our inaugural Climate Crisis Lecture. I'd like to thank Simon and the fellows on our Climate Crisis Committee for leading this undertaking. It's really fabulous to see it come to fruition. St John's is working very hard operationally to address our own climate impacts. We've got ambitious research-led schemes underway to degasify our main site, reduce our energy consumption. We're developing off-site passive house standard student accommodation. Next year, we start on site to deliver really significant biodiversity improvements to the college landscape. And these are all really important and necessary steps to transform our carbon and biodiversity metrics. We are very committed to them. But we're very clear in this college that the biggest contribution we can possibly make to the long-term sustainability and indeed viability of our planet is through the research community that we support, nurture, and in some cases fund here. And we feel very fortunate in the breadth and depth of our fellowship, of our postgraduate and our research associate community, in the focus they bring to dimensions of the climate and biodiversity crises. I hope to that end you took some time to look at the brilliant summer project reports from some of our students who undertook research schemes this summer through the Climate Crisis Committee. And I'm sure that the discussion after the lecture will remind us all how Collegiate Cambridge is able to harness interdisciplinary inquiry and problem solving to an extraordinary extent. After the lecture, Simon's going to brilliantly orchestrate initial responses from three members of the college, Professor Sir David King, Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon, and Professor Sir Richard Lazarus, who's currently a visiting fellow here from Harvard University. Partha will respond to their initial observations, and then there'll be a Q&A. Later on, there'll be some refreshments in the foyer. So, turning to our speaker. I find it hard to overestimate the impact that Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, Frank Ramsey, Emeritus Professor of Economics in this university, honoured with the Knight Grand Cross for services to economics and the natural environment, the impact that he's had on the theory and the economics of sustainable development, beginning long before that term became prominent. Partha is widely recognised worldwide and long esteemed for his continuing and influential contributions, and of course most recently for his groundbreaking review on the economics of biodiversity. In many ways that's been a culmination of 4 decades of work in which Partha has pushed the boundaries of traditional economics and laid bare the connection between the health of the planet and the viability of sustainable development. Last week I was in 3 separate meetings. I was in a meeting with the Cabinet Minister, I was in a meeting with the Permanent Secretary, and I was in a meeting with leaders of agriculture in England. All 3 meetings referenced Partha Dasgupta as an influence on the approach they're taking in policy and delivery. I think we're probably all experiencing that in any touch point we have in this subject. So Partha's influence and reach is really quite legendary, and we are incredibly proud to count him a Fellow of St John's. Partha, I'm honoured to invite you to deliver our inaugural Climate Crisis Lecture on the subject Economic Possibilities in the Anthropocene.
Well, thank you very much, the Master, and guests who have arrived here. It's an honor and a pleasure. I've been here now for nearly 40 years as a fellow, and I realized that actually this is all the Master's doing. She wants to know what I've been up to. And this is my progress report, so to speak. One reason, she mentioned rightly, that I've been working on these problems for about 40 years. Why so slow? That's because I'm slow. It's also very hard. It was a very hard area to dip into, get into, because it hadn't been studied. So in some sense, there was a construction work to be done as well. There's bits and pieces of economics lying all around the place, and I'm an economic theorist by training and inclination, and I was trying to put them together to create a tapestry of how we should think about the world we live in and our daily interchange. That seems to me to be the reason for doing economics. It's not about grand things, it's about small things, and the totality of small things is, of course, the grand thing itself. But I've always felt that economics is really about our day-to-day life. When we go for a walk, what do we do do we water our lawn? Or should we have a lawn? That sort of thing. That nature is we're embedded in nature is not a self-evident statement, claim. It's particularly, it comes home to us that it's not self-evident by the fact that nature is rarely ever mentioned in economics. I've done a little bit of digging into the history of economic thought, thinking, believing that maybe we were spoiled sometime in the 20th century. Nothing of the sort. Nature was never in economics. Right from the earliest stages, there was mention, of course, land, that's for sure. But land was seen as a indestructible piece. So it was a finite resource, but indestructible of various grades too, inferior land, superior land, and so forth. But the idea was to explain the transition from rich land to poor land, so to speak, as economies developed. So we are looking at an asset which has been absent, and yet, of course, you might think that economics is about asset management, that we manage our assets. It could be tables, chairs, machines, books, all that sort of thing, or the stocks of capital assets that we have. But we, in economics, started with thinking of assets as land, as I was mentioning, of course, and produced capital, machines, equipment, books, and so forth. And then later, subsequently, it was realized that, of course, we also accumulate human capital. Education is a prime example, maintenance of health. So that required some doing because measuring human capital is no mean feat, but progress has been made in doing that as well. So the pair of tangible assets, if you like, that we've been studying, the subject has been studying, the discipline has been studying, have been produced in human capital. Then there is the intangible infrastructure on which we all live. That includes institutions, culture, religion, and so forth, okay? That we sort of think of that as a sort of a capital asset which envelopes us. We are part of it. We make use of it. We work in accordance with it to make the exchanges that we care about. That's basically the background in which economic theory has an application, has progressed. Now, one deep reason I thought nature got excluded during the period I've been working on it is that since 1950, the post-war period has been unprecedented. It's not for nothing that people talk of this period as the era of the Anthropocene, the human-dominated one. That looks at the state of society. It's like on the negative side, we are dominating. On the flip side, the positive side, which attracts the economist, is the progress that we have actually made. And I want to show you the first slide. Past 74 years now, global GDP has increased more than 15-fold. Per capita, global GDP has increased more than 5-fold. Population has increased 3-fold, plus 3-plus fold from 2.5 to 8.1 plus billion. life expectancy at birth has increased from 46 years to 72 years. These are all global statistics, okay? I'm averaging now, and I'll be mostly speaking about global statistics, but right towards the end, I'll use the technology I developed in this lecture to talk about local problems, which will be of interest to all of us here. The proportion of people living in extreme poverty has declined from more than 60% to less than 10%. These statistics suggest humanity, that is the average person, has never had it so good. And in fact, if you read The Economist, perhaps occasionally the occasional doubt occurs in their writings, you will find that this is what is driving their policy. It's this incredible progress that's been made over the past 74 years or so. Now, these statistics if you look at these statistics, there's one capital asset which is missing, namely natural capital, nature. But I'm using natural capital in a general sense. You can think of it as of ecosystems, okay? So the bits and pieces of nature will be the ingredients that make for nature. And that's all right. The heterogeneity of nature shouldn't bother anybody who studies capital assets, because desks are different from chairs, and they're in turn different from buildings. So heterogeneity shouldn't be a problem. I will be thinking of nature as essentially a combination of ecosystems, which can range from a drop of water to the Amazon forest. That too is all right. Range is extensive. And when I talk about nature, I mean ecosystems. But of course, that tells me immediately that I'm moving towards the idea of stocks, assets. And notice here, the statistics that are here, in particular GDP, we're looking at flows. GDP is a particularly bad index to use to judge the progress of a society or regress of a society for two reasons. One is that it's a flow, so many dollars per year. Whereas I began by thinking of stocks, dollars, period. And by the way, the moment I use the word dollar, don't think that I'm just a monetarist. I could be measuring everything in terms of apples. All right? That's just a way of describing in familiar units of measurement, dollars. So that's GDP, that's one problem with it. But there is a more problematic feature of GDP is that its G stands for gross. So it's gross output. GDP is the market value of the final goods and services that is produced in an economy, okay? But it does not include, or exclude, if you like, the depreciation of capital assets that might go with the production of GDP. Now, normally, if you ignore natural capital, you might say, well, that's not a big deal, because, well, we have estimates of how buildings depreciate, roads depreciate, and so forth. Let's put a 5% or even 10% down. Well, then we'll use that rough figure to depreciate it and not talk about GDP, but net domestic product. Well, the problem is that with Mother Nature, she's destroyable. So whether she is or not is for us, for the human economy to decide in the aggregate. This destruction causes the problem. That is to say, we don't know at what rate we are destroying it. And I mean, unless we are careful, we would be destroying it without any. And I want to come to, before I come to any further thing, I want to ask as to why we might be particularly worried about the depreciation of natural capital, I mean nature, the ecosystems. One problem with nature, which of course makes her so fertile and so, I mean, when I say problem, from the economist measurement point of view, is she's mobile. She's also very often, the processes that drive nature are often silent and invisible. So there's measurement problems that arise. And I'll come back to that when I systematically look at the kinds of services and goods Mother Nature offers us, okay? But bear that in mind, we are looking at an asset management problem, and I want to talk about that. Now, the master very kindly mentioned the report on biodiversity that I prepared for the UK government nearly 4 years ago now. And when I began writing it, I realized it was not going to be on biodiversity because we don't even know how many species we have on Earth. Could be any estimates can range from 8 to 20, possibly a lot more million of eukaryotes, never mind the fungi and other species that are other organisms that exist. What we can manage is, of course, land or sea, areas. And so we have to infer where organisms lie or inhabit by looking at the ecosystems, which is why I'm avoiding the notion of biodiversity here and talking about ecosystem productivity, to which, of course, biodiversity contributes hugely. And I don't want to go into that very much unless commentators want to take it up. But, of course, I was looking at biodiversity, the value of biodiversity in instrumental terms, in terms of what it does to raise the productivity of ecosystem. And I'll come back to the services that we get. Okay. The progress that is mentioned here, if I look at is now that I've set up this story, that there are stocks of capital assets, human capital, produced capital, and natural capital producing all the goods and services that we enjoy. This enormous success over the last 70 years, as reflected in the statistics, has been achieved by an accumulation of produced capital, roads, buildings, ports, machines, and human capital, health, education, skills, and character. But that success has been accompanied by the decumulation of natural capital, and I'll give you examples of that in a minute. Wetlands, grasslands, mangroves, coral reefs, woodlands, forests, lakes, and such biomes as the atmosphere, the oceans, the soils, and subsoil resources. So I'm now already introduced a new category of assets into the economic system, which has been ignored by economists in general ever since economics was founded. And we want to see how it plays out. The reason it's easy to miss nature, as I said, is she's mobile, and therefore property rights to natural capital can be very hard to establish, let alone maintain. So that the price that we pay for using natural capital is often far below what she's worth. And often it's zero. We don't pay for it. Take the case of emitting carbon into the atmosphere. This asset that we are polluting is the atmosphere. The pollutant is the byproduct of our other activities like driving a car or flying in an airplane, but we're damaging the asset in question, and we're not paying necessarily for that because nobody owns the atmosphere. It's a common free rider problem, very commonly discussed in the literature. So that sort of gives us an idea as to why there will be excessive pressure on this class of category of assets, okay? And I'm sure you're familiar with this idea. Now, I keep on talking about asset management. Why? Even although the natural language of economics is in terms of flows, outputs of goods and services, GDP and so on. And the reason is pretty obvious. What we give to our children are assets. When we educate them, we are building up their human capital. What we bequeath to them when we die is whatever assets we have, the home, if we have one, properties, and so forth. So every transaction you should think of is an assets transaction. We are looking at asset management. And I want to harp on that because I'm going to show you very quickly, those of you who think about managing assets, as to how we have gone wrong. So let me give you an example of how we've gone wrong in the normal economic transactions. When you think of managing assets, the first rule that you think of is that the rates of return on the assets you hold should be risk-adjusted, equalized. Because if one asset has a risk-adjusted return higher than another in your assessment, you would hardly like to hold the one which is inferior. You'll try and sell it. You'll get to the higher one. So the first rule is risk-adjusted rates of return on holding the assets should be the same in your portfolio. Okay? It's hard to think of it, but that's the idea. Now, the return itself is a sum of two things. One is the yield of a capital asset, and the other is the capital gains or loss. You can compare it and see. This is your daily calculation that you provide if you hold assets and you're talking to your broker, or the broker is telling you why he or she is shifting her assets around. That's the idea, that the rates of return, risk-adjusted, should be the same, and it will be the yield plus the capital gains. Now, here's a nice example of where we've gone wrong. The Ganges, which is a holy river in India, we call her Ma Ganga, okay? She's highly polluted. But there was a Ganges action plan some decades ago to clean up the Ganges, at which point some economists tried to assess the value that people would ascribe to a cleaner Ganges. And so they did a huge survey asking people who lived in the Gangetic Plain. It was a multi-million-dollar research project trying to gain an understanding of their willingness to pay for cleaning up the Ganges. Using that and data on the project itself, how much it will cost and so forth, that the government had furnished, the authors estimated that the internal rate of return on such a project would be 15%. Let's take the amount as a fact. Okay, 15% rate of return, that's rather high. Now, on the other hand, government bonds and the combination of government bonds and equities in India was approximately 5% yield. So you have a gap between 15% on the investment in the Ganges and 5% yield. Now, if these two assets were held by the society, the Indian population, in an efficient way, then of course the yields would have been the rates of return would be the same, which would mean the Ganges price relative to income should be declining by 10%, 15% minus 5%. It was only then that the two assets would have the equal returns. But that's absurd, because the Ganges is becoming more polluted, and incomes are rising. So her value should be increasing, not declining. So it's a very simple, you might even say cheap way of showing that there is a misallocation of resource allocation in the Indian economy. But of course, this translates into pretty much any pair of assets you like to think of, which includes natural capital, no matter which country you're looking at. You will find an imbalance there. It's just a way of saying we're mismanaging. And I've already given you a reason as to why we are mismanaging, because nature is too cheap. We're not paying for it. In fact, there was a spoof that the New York Times produced 3 years ago, following my review, in which they portrayed me as a doddery old professor, but correctly summarized the entire 600-page review in one sentence. Pay for what you consume, which is exactly right, of course. The art of economics is to try and figure out what the payment should be and why. Okay? Right. I said that this recent success, this success of the last 70 years has been at the expense of natural capital. But now you compare it with the Brundtland Commission's report of 1987, which defines sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Notice, this is in the language not of, let's go for economic growth at 5%. It's actually put its finger on the right object, which is assets, saying that we ought to leave behind for the future what we had, at least as much as we had inherited ourselves. Now, there's a problem with it, because there are assets and there are assets. Some will accumulate, some will decumulate. By definition, an exhaustible resource will be less at the end of the year than the year before, at the beginning of the year, because you'll have used up some. So trivially, you're going to lose some, question is, are you compensating by accumulating the others? That's at the heart of the Brun Report. The question, and the answer is yes, you can do that. You can create an index which will do that for you for the Brundtland requirement that we are leaving behind adequate amount. And that index is, as you might expect, the notion of wealth. That's all we mean. What we need to do is to ask whether, if we value all the assets that we bequeath to our children at their right prices, and I'll come back to the idea of right prices at question time, but you can have an intuitive idea, then if we leave behind the amount of wealth that we had ourselves inherited, and possibly more, then we are essentially leaving behind for the children the capital or the productive capacity at least as high as we had ourselves inherited. And that cares about the future. That takes into account the future. Notice, this is about wealth, not income. So when Adam Smith wrote his great book on the wealth of nations, he did not write on the GDP of nations. And it was a good reason. Of course, we understand the notion of wealth much better now than we did in 1776, which is when the Wealth of Nations was published. For one thing, we include natural capital. But the idea is straightforward. I've already now taken some time, but shifted the ground of attention from flows to stocks. And that's, I think, how we should proceed. Okay. On the other hand, what we have done, this is a good example of the process by which we have enjoyed our progress in recent years. One of the UNEP estimate, 1992 to 2014, measure of human capital per capita increased globally by some 20%. Produced capital per capita doubled in that period, but natural capital per capita declined by 40%. So this trade-off is pretty straightforward. We have been accumulating two classes of assets, but accumulating the third. Now, this on itself, of course, does not mean that it's been a bad idea. Because remember, I was talking about wealth. You should be adding up these three and then seeing whether the aggregate, the wealth, is increasing or declining. Unfortunately, recent estimates say that we've done just that, namely decline. The global wealth has actually, per capita has declined when that wealth includes natural capital. Okay, but of course there are other more direct measures of the loss of natural capital. Extinction rates of species currently at 100 to 1,000 times the average extinction rates in the previous several million years. That translates to the projection that some 10% of species will disappear in the next 100 years. Now, this is very dangerous. This is dangerous because one of the things that we should bear in mind when we think about valuing species is that they have not just an existence value, but they have a value which you could realize if they prove to be more valuable than you think they are, okay? And it's called an option value. Leaving your options open is a very good idea, no matter what your attitude to risk is, because no matter what, you can't do worse if you have more options than less, okay? Species are there, you don't even know they exist. We don't know whether they're valuable or not, but we may know we know that we may know in the future whether they're valuable or how much more valuable they are. And so there's a precautionary reason for preserving them. A parallel sign is the decline at more macro level in the biosphere's ability to meet our demands for its goods and services sustainably. The International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in 2020 found that 18 of the 24 ecosystems that the panel had studied were in poor health, some near to exhaustion. So now I've been talking about what Mother Nature offers us, and I want to classify them following the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to give you a better sense of the tensions that we face when we deploy nature for our purposes. The biosphere is a self-regenerative asset, supplying us with a variety of goods and services. And ecologists have offered a two-way classification of nature's goods and services. The first, provisioning goods, food, water, timber, fibers, pharmaceutical products, non-living material. Now, this is, as you can see immediately, this list of provisioning goods, which at market prices, if you aggregate them, turns out to be, with human ingenuity, we transform these provisioning goods into what we call GDP. So these are the demands that we make of nature. We harvest or extract provisioning goods. It could be, as I say, food, water, timber, and so forth. The other set are much more subtle, regulating and maintenance services. They are climate regulation, decomposition of waste, nitrogen fixation, air and water purification, soil regeneration, pollination, and so on and so on and so on. These are processes. It's important to distinguish between these two. First are goods and the others are processes. And processes are harder to tackle because they give rise to the goods. Without the regulating and maintenance services, there would be no provisioning goods at all. On the other hand, of course, provisioning goods themselves help to maintain the regulating and maintenance services, just as earthworms, for example, which are provisioning goods, are helping to recreate soil, and thereby the services that soil offers us. So there is synergy between the provisioning goods and regulating and maintenance services. Now, the key reason I'm emphasizing this distinction is to make clear as to why the economics of biodiversity, my review, was so different from the economics of climate change that had been previously submitted to the UK government by Lord Stern. And the reason is that climate change is climate regulation. By regulation, I don't mean regulation by the authorities, I mean natural this carbon cycle, that's what I mean by regulation, climate regulation, is only one of the many regulating and maintenance services. I've already listed a few here on this slide. And the key thing about them is that these services are complementary to one another. They're not substitutes. That's extremely important because it means that if you press hard against one of the services, undoing one of them, then the others in due course are going to feel the pressure too. Now, nature is not a house of cards, fortunately. She's resilient. But we are now so many of us and so clever that if we put our mind to it, we can turn her into a house of cards, and we are doing that at the moment. The extinction rates that I've just now mentioned shows that. So these complementarities have to be taken very, very seriously. And one criticism I have of the economics of climate change, as it was formulated recently, was that it focused on ways out of climate problems by creating substitutes, clean energy. Nothing wrong with that, everything right about it, but for the complacency you have in thinking that you can move there without disturbing other maintenance services and regulating services. For example, the material that you need in order to be able to create clean energy, if the demand for energy just keeps on rising, is one which will put pressure on the many other provisioning goods and therefore the regulating and maintenance services, okay? So that's the cautionary tale that you cannot isolate one bit of the biosphere and focus on that. Doing that has dangers. It can be corrected, and I like to think that we are in the process of correcting that in the public domain. People are sensitive to the idea that to get clean energy requires resources from elsewhere of a different sort, and that'll put pressure on. It'll involve more mining, quarrying, and land use changes, which can affect these other resources. Okay. Now, I've given some suggestion as to why the demand that we are making for nature is so severe now. One reason, of course, is that nature is underpriced, so that like open access resources, we make too much demand on it, so pressure is in place. So the question is, how much of this excess demand? There has been now some wonderful attempts at estimating the demand we make for nature's provisioning goods, okay? Because that's what we can measure. We can only infer what happens to the maintenance and regulating services by looking at the health of ecosystems. But what we are making actual demands on are the provisioning goods. So when I talk about global demand, I mean the global demand for provisioning goods. By one estimate, the global demand for provisioning goods, sometimes some people call it the human ecological footprint, today exceeds the natural regeneration rate of provisioning goods. But the ratio is, I'm sorry, this is the ratio of the global demand to the natural regeneration rate, this is bad English, is 1.7. That's why people say we need 1.7 Earths to meet our current human demands. And I'll come and try and formulate it for you. This is, by the way, I'm going to give you a formula in a minute, but then remember, don't complain, this is St. John's College. It's a very mathsy place. So if I didn't give a formula, then my colleagues are going to take me to task at dinner time. But even 1.7 is an underestimate, the excess demand that we're making on provisioning goods, because it does not include the birth that we need to give other organisms to flourish if we are to acknowledge that they possess the option value that I mentioned earlier, previously. We need to give them a lot more space, birth, if you like, the other organisms, before we can say that we're doing all right in keeping the future open. So now I'm going to show you how to think about estimating the gap. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to policy, you do need to know which factors, which variables you're going to put some pressure on, trying to modulate. Now, the idea is to estimate the impact we have, or the footprint that we leave on Mother Nature in the terms of the demands we make for provisioning goods. So that's clear. Question is, what does that demand depend on? Well, presumably you will say human activity. Fine. The question is, how do we measure that activity? Well, being an economist, of course, I would say first port of call should be GDP. That's the measure that says what we're doing. Now, it's missing a lot of things. Huge amounts of activities are missed in GDP, okay? But there is a trick I'll show you by which we can actually correct for that mistake, okay? So let's, for the moment, think of GDP. Well, GDP is in terms of goods and services, okay? Measured in dollars, let's say. But on the other hand, what Mother Nature is offering us are primary products, these provisional goods. So we need a transformation from one to the other. So what we ask for is, per unit of GDP, how much of provisioning goods in the aggregate are we using? And then transforming with human ingenuity into output of final goods and products, which amount to GDP, okay? By GDP, you mean final goods and products at market prices, okay? And we're aggregating, so I'll be thinking that we can always aggregate for our purposes here. If you feel we can't aggregate, then everything I say can be extended to think in terms of vectors, different inequalities, comparisons of different types of provisioning goods. Here I'm aggregating them all into a bundle of provisioning goods, into a whole. Now, so GDP, what is GDP? Well, it'll be tautologically total population multiplied by per capita GDP. So I'm going to call the first capital N, and Y is the per capita, okay? Now, I'm going to introduce a symbol, alpha, to denote the efficiency with which we transform provisioning goods of the Mother Nature into final products, GDP, okay? If we are very efficient, we don't waste, alpha will be high. That's a high efficiency. So it follows that GDP divided by alpha is humanity's ecological footprint. Now, if capital G is the regeneration rate of provisioning goods, then we have what I'll call the impact inequality. It's the current imbalance between the demand the demand, which is the human ecological footprint, and supply regeneration rate of provisioning goods. And that inequality can be represented as the left-hand side is GDP divided by alpha, the right-hand side is nature's provisioning goods. I'm going to stop here just to give you a sense of how to think about this inequality, because it is crucial. It is important that we should move from just abstract thinking to something concrete on which we can build our understanding of what's going on. Think of a fishery. Now, that's about the simplest ecosystem you can imagine. It's got a single product, fish of a particular variety. Okay, it's a single fishery. The stock of fish in the fishery is what I'm calling is nature stock. The fish itself is the flow is the provisioning good that the fishery supplies. Okay, the provisioning commodity. You're a fisher person and you are harvesting fish. If the rate of harvest exceeds the rate of regeneration of the fishery, then the stock is going to decline. It'll continue to decline until you've killed the fishery. All right? On the other hand, if you take not more than its regeneration rate, less than, then the stock will increase until you come to the carrying capacity of the fishery. All that is very straightforward. The trick for the fisherman who wants to fish for a long while, many years, is to keep enough there, never to exceed too much. So, roughly speaking, it wants to balance off the amount it takes with the regeneration rate of the fishery. When it does so, you have an equilibrium, a sustainable fishing. We violate it all the time. For example, the cod fishery in the North Sea, that's an expression of that inequality I've just mentioned. What we harvest exceeds the regeneration rate, and so the stock declines. So you should feel free to use the fishery analogy to explain pretty much everything we do with Mother Nature. I found that, by the way, that really speaking, you don't lose anything by sticking to one example to get a sense of what's going on, okay? So that's the story here. The right-hand side, capital G, is Mother Nature's productivity, the rate at which she can replenish herself. The left-hand side is how much we're taking out of it. So policy-wise, the idea is to reduce, if there is an inequality here, and there, as I said, the ratio between the left-hand side to the right-hand side has been estimated to be about 1.7, which means that, of course, it's an inequality, which is the left-hand side exceeds the right-hand side. And the way to do that would be to reduce, one way of reducing ny divided by alpha, the one which is most comforting to all of us, is to raise alpha, make us more efficient. And when we move to clean energy, for example, that idea is designed to show that you can increase alpha through technological advancement or institutional improvements. Don't waste 50% of the food that's grown that's wasted. If you can reduce that, you'll be raising your alpha. So the examples are abundant. Ways of doing it is to improve the efficiency with which we use provisioning goods and transform them into final products. So that's your alpha. That's the one which is most appealing to us. The others are not so appealing. The others would be to reduce small y. But cutting GDP per capita, standard of living, at least the standard of living that we think is a standard of living, that doesn't look all that appetizing. And never mind about population. You can't touch that. So we have a problem here. And the reason this is a useful way of going about it is at least it lays bare what's on offer and what we can work with. So alpha depends not only on technology, but of course on institutions. And if you, for example, you start pricing natural capital in a way that should be, that would raise alpha. You'll be more efficient in using natural capital. Let me give you some examples. And that tells us as to why we are overdrawing. I've given no sense of why we are overdrawing. We're not paying for nature. Consider the oceans, the open seas, the high seas. Nobody pays to sail across the high seas. Now that sounds odd. It's odd because that's a finite resource, big, that's for sure, but nobody's paying. You might think that if you were owner of the oceans, you surely would have charged P&O and others for using the right to take goods and services up. Trillions of dollars of commodities are transported across the oceans, and yet nobody pays a rent for doing that. The expenditure is, of course, transport cost, but transport cost doesn't include payment for the right to use the oceans. Now, you might think then that the oceans are overdrawn. And you'd be right. You have the same inequality going on. The replenishment rate of possibilities of the oceans is less than the pressure we put on the oceans. So this ny divided by alpha greater than capital G works for the oceans too. Remember, I've given this in the aggregate form, but you can take that analogy, this inequality, to specific ecosystems. No problem in doing that. Okay. So you might think that the right thing would be to start charging these trillions of dollars of merchandise that are big, companies and countries which are shipping goods and services. Crude estimates suggest we could be raising double-digit billions a year in doing that. What would we do? When I say we, of course, it's the global economy, because the oceans are common property. They are global commons. So the natural owner, quote unquote, if we were to think of that, would be the international community of nations. Now, simple calculations suggest that we could draw double-digit billions. Now, what we could do with them would be, one possibility would be, raise that money and subsidize another set of global public goods, which, however, are not, unlike the atmosphere and the oceans, are not commons, global commons, but, are not global commons, but are actually located in nations, within nations. And there, of course, the classic examples are tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests are a global public good. They serve all of us. They influence the climate, so forth, preserve so much of biodiversity. But on the other hand, they're not open access. They're not like the atmosphere. They are housed in particular countries. And they rightly can argue that why should we be subsidizing the rest of the world? We need to develop, so we cut down the trees in the Amazon and raise money and so forth. Now, we complain. Of course we complain. We hear that Brazil loses forest to the size of Portugal every other year. We don't like that, but the right thing to do would be to think of paying Brazil to not do it. To compensate is like a payment for ecosystem services, something that is now commonplace within nations, including our own here, and China, Costa Rica. There's now an abundant set of payments for ecosystem services that the government makes to landowners. People pay to others for services rendered by their natural capital that they hold. The idea here would be to use that formulation, to use the tax on the oceans to pay for the preservation of the tropical rainforest. That's just one example, of course, okay? And I made that very freely in my review, and I was told roundly that it's a great idea, but the time is not right for that by people who know, UN Secretary General and others assured me in Zoom meetings that it's a very good idea, but time is not right for that to happen. But that's there for us to take advantage of. The New York Times spoof talked about pay for what we use, and I want to give conclude in the next 5-10 minutes, sample of global to local policies. I've mentioned two global policies. I want now to speak a little bit about local ones. One difference between the economics of climate change and the economics of biodiversity, or put it this way, the way I'm developing the idea of the economics of nature, is that climate change is in some sense remote. Not remote in experience of climate change, that's not remote, that's to everybody, everybody experiences it, but it's remote in terms of what we can do about it. Each of us is minute, and we can discipline ourselves to behave in accordance with zero net emission or whatever. But it takes some doing, because it is a burden, and we can always say, well, look, I'm so small, I'm not really contributing to climate change. I'm nothing. It's the aggregate which matters, and I'm a small fraction, 1 upon 8.1 billion, for that, if you want to use that kind of reasoning. Biodiversity is different. Biodiversity is all around us. The locality matters. And the biodiversity in my neighborhood matters to me a lot more than perhaps biodiversity in another neighborhood, and vice versa. But of course, that also gives us the potential incentive to protect it. And I think that in some deep sense, that's where our salvation lies, in the sense of recognizing that minding your own garden, your own ecosystem, the one around you, gets you a long way. Because even if others go under, so long as yours stays, of course it'll be going under too, but at a slower pace perhaps, if you could. So if we all did that, there would be some hope for salvation. And that leads me to a point that has really disturbed me in recent years, which is, to me now, the encroachment on biodiversity, the assault, the brutal assault that we are making to other organisms, other creatures, biodiversity writ large, arises not necessarily from large-scale phenomena, which is what I've been emphasizing so far with the statistics that I've given you, but are being influenced by local activities, bit by bit. It's the bit-by-bit encroachment on biodiversity, which I think is particularly insidious because we can actually avoid it. By bit, I mean at every stage it'll be a small thing. It could be, bit by bit, I mean things of the following sort. You have a choice of expanding your community of housing, but it'll come at the expense of a bat population because you'll be encroaching on a bit of reserve. At the margin, you say, well, people need homes. That's just yet another bat population. So the bat population goes. That's one example. Another would be to extend a busway in our city. And that might, to save costs, cut across an orchard, an ancient orchard, which we value. But again, at the margin, you're saving 20 million. Let's do it. It's easy. It's very easy, but it's these bit by bit ones which are leads to the accumulation of a destruction of natural capital. Sometimes we read about wonderful mangrove forests being destroyed because that's where tourists like to go. So why not create a hotel complex that encroaches on the... Now it has a pluses and minuses. It enables people to go and view it, and then the subtext is the incentive to preserve the mangroves and the forest is higher. And on the other hand, of course, you've destroyed some of the mangrove in order to be able to protect the rest of it. So you can see how, again, bit by bit, then there'll be an expansion of demand. So, well, what about extending the hotel complex a little bit? So it's that accumulation of chipping away at natural capital, at the locality, which to me now seems to be particularly insidious because that's where I used to think that's where the advantage lies in biodiversity protection because we have an incentive to do something about it, and we can. But if at every stage we make in my judgment, the wrong move because we want to save a bit of money or some convenience, then at the end of the day, we have a desiccated neighborhood. And that seems to me to be, in some sense, a corruption of our own lives. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Partha, for such a very stimulating lecture. It's now the unenviable task of our three commenters to follow that. First up, we will be inviting Sir David King, who is also a fellow of this college, ex-government chief scientific officer for a number of years in the 2000s. Currently chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Committee Group and an honorary fellow of St. John's. David, would you like to give us a few minutes of your thoughts from here? Yes.
I shall come and sit next to Partha.
I'll get the chair.
I arrived in the college also nearly 40 years ago, and there was Partha, and we became very good friends from that moment to this. I don't know whether I mean by this it's going to come to an end. But let me say that all the economics I understand, I learnt from that period discussing issues with Partha. And I think what we've heard is a critically important account of the state of the world and the way economics looks at that state of the world and the way economics has failed to put any attention onto ecosystems. Now, I'm going to, first of all, say a few things about what I understand about the economic system working together with the political systems of the world. And I say this right away because I'm particularly up against, I was running negotiations from the Foreign Office for quite a few years, and the discovery that the big hegemon of the day, the United States, was not only not leading on climate change, but was blocking every kind of action on climate change. There's a big question mark about that. Why did successive Democratic and Republican presidents not take the hegemon leadership position after 1992 when we had that meeting in Rio? And I'm asking this question because today we're in an extraordinarily challenging situation. If we were to give up use of fossil fuels tomorrow, that would not manage the problem. We already are losing 30 million tons of ice from Greenland per hour, billions of tons a year. And that ice goes into water and the sea levels will rise eventually by 7.5 meters, just from Greenland's ice melting. And that looks as if it's now happening irreversibly, because we've had no action since 1992. So what I want to throw into the discussion is what I now believe, that roughly half, if not more, of senators and congressmen in the United States are in the pockets of a very big and important lobby, which is the fossil fuel lobby in the United States, led by the owners of the coal industry, but also followed through by oil and gas. So what we have is a situation where I would have said the power of wealth, but Partha is telling me that wealth has or should have a different meaning, and that Adam Smith should have had that meaning much more clearly spelt out. So let me say moneyed wealth. The power of these extraordinarily wealthy people making money out of fossil fuels means that they subvert the science. I mean, for me, this is so frustrating to have this powerful body of people subverting what the science is telling us we should be doing. And what, may I say, Partha is saying as well. So what we're up against is a political system in which the power of moneyed wealth in our societies, remember the cigarette lobby, we also understand the press barons, and this is where the wealth has such a big global impact. So I think when we look at the business of our economic system, I'm going to say it has been extraordinarily good for improving human well-being. Partha's figures show that very, very clearly. But it has also been very bad for our ecosystems. In fact, I would say the economic system we have is driven entirely by consumerism, and we are, as has been shown by our speaker today, we are over-consuming on our ecosystem resources. But that's built into our economic mode of living. It's driven by consumerism. The Climate Crisis Advisory Group that I chair has put in a report at the beginning of last week on how China is dealing with climate change. There's another issue here politically. There is no country in the world doing as much as China is doing on climate change, and the country that I would like to now point out as the country that's leading in the reverse direction is the United States. Right, so what we see in China is the development of renewable energy systems, whether it's solar power, which they're now managing to produce for the whole world, whether it's wind turbines, whether it's nuclear power, whether it's hydropower, they're leading the world on all of these. They are producing more than the rest of the world put together. So what I'm saying is, I believe we really need a cultural revolution, a cultural transition. I'm being told to stop talking, but let me say what I mean by that in one sentence. We need an ecological civilization to succeed the civilization that has been based on wealth creation through consumerism. And in an ecological civilization, equal value should be given to human well-being as we give to the well-being of our ecosystems. And I'm now going to just finish by saying, and by the way, and it'll be surprising to many people, since 2012, the Communist Party, and I'm not a member, the Communist Party in China has included ecological civilization as its objective, and the government of China in 2015 also changed its constitution to add that. That's the way forward. I'm afraid we can't put a financial value onto our ecosystems, and I could go through the arguments if I had enough time. Maybe I should have another lecture. But the point I'm just making is we need really to survey carefully the damage we've done, why we've done it, and how we should move forward. Thank you.
Right. Excellent. We clearly have a debate on our hands, which is wonderful. Our next commenter is a current fellow of the college, Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon. She is the Professor of Climate Change Policy and the Director of the Centre for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Government here in Cambridge. She has been involved in all kinds of things, international meetings and important events. She is currently being elected as the Vice Chair of the European Scientific Advisory Body on Climate Change. So, Laura, please come and give us a few minutes of your thoughts.
Well, thanks, first of all, to the Climate Crisis Committee for inviting me to respond to Partha's comments. I've long been an admirer of his work, of course. I'll try to make 3 points. The first one is kind of a response to the very stimulating comments on some of the research on climate, right? And some of the focus on climate change and climate change policy on substitutes, right? Without looking at some of the other resources that may be involved in addressing climate change. And this kind of comment made me think about some of the work that we have done in the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change in trying to understand what are some of the scenarios in terms of policies, in terms of technologies, and in terms of behavior change that could be consistent with the climate neutrality goal that the European Union, just like the UK, have for 2050. And of course, it's not surprising that when we were looking at the different scenarios and the policies that might be needed to get to climate neutrality by 2050, we had different scenarios. One of them was a scenario of reduced demand for goods and services, for energy. One was more focused on all-out renewable energy deployment, and one that was looking at a mixture of some reduced demand, a lot of carbon dioxide removal, and a wider range of technologies, including additional nuclear. When we were looking at some of the at these different scenarios, what was clear is that it was the first scenario that was more able to achieve or at least advance a wide range of sustainable development goals, including biodiversity, for example. So this notion that a single focus on one of the climate services or nature services, in this case climate stability, to be able to feed people, to be able to keep our ecosystems. It's clear that some options, some policy options to get to climate neutrality are better able to deliver on other objectives. The second comment that I wanted to make is on the different assets, right? So one of the really helpful things in the review and the comments that Professor Dasgupta gave were on the technical capital, human capital, and natural capital, as well as institutional capital. And I think one thing that we've learned also over the past 20 years from working on energy innovation and climate policy, which is the area that I work on, is that some of there are more things that we can do to come up with some of these technology alternatives that can increase alpha in your equation, right? Is both the pricing efforts, but also some of the supply side efforts to support technological innovation more directly through things like R&D investments, financing for risky projects that might make options, that create technological options that are not available today. So I think that if I were to think about what is a little bit more hopeful in my mind in terms of our ability as a society to both address the climate crisis, but also deal with other nature problems, is related to some of the policies that were put in place to reduce by orders of magnitude the cost of solar panels, of wind on and offshore, lithium-ion batteries, solid-state lighting, a range of issues. It was mainly through a set of policies from R&D to early tax incentives for technology deployment, cheap financing in different parts around the globe that made these technologies possible. So I think that one of the things that makes me hopeful is that a combination of the paying for nature, but also actually investing in creating technological options that can help get us out of this mess, at least to a greater extent than we are today. I think this is one of the areas where we have a lot of solid evidence in terms of assessing the relationship between different types of fiscal incentives, regulatory policies, from the bans on incandescent light bulbs to feed-in tariffs or renewable energy options for renewables, to a mix of policies from cheap financing to in some cases, mandates for zero electric vehicles. Those sorts of policies we now know were instrumental in making possible cost reductions in technologies that nobody saw coming, even in the late 2010s. So I think this is one of the areas where I think the assets framework with the combination of the institutional capital. So what are the policies, what institutions we need to have in place to make possible to improve the set of options, the technical capital that we can use to address some of these issues. I think this framework of the assets and capital and the interaction between them it makes this area very complex, as you were saying. It's a very difficult area, but I think we're beginning to learn a little bit how perhaps improving, being innovative in the policies and institutions can help make possible and give to the next generation technologies in the technical capital side that can help us. The last point I will make, and I will be brief, I know I'm running out of time, is that it's also clear that we need to think much more about fairness and distributional issues, not just within Western countries, but also globally. Again, this is something that I know is embedded in your comments. You make the example of India. But I think we've also learned that while a lot of these policies that I was mentioning that created new technological options that made solar the cheapest energy source on the planet, we also have seen that some of the same policies haven't had the same impacts when different institutions try to get low-income or middle-income countries to implement them. So we do see that some of the same policies don't have the same impacts, both on the deployment of some of these renewable energy technologies, but also on their ability to improve their human capital and learn and also benefit from this transition. I can give you many examples of this. We've looked at a lot of these questions on international development organizations and finance, both from China, but also from the World Bank and other development banks. And we haven't seen as much local benefit to some of these countries, let's say, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think this is an area where both because of limitations in finance, but also institutional capability and human capability, we need to be paying much more attention internationally and as researchers to ensure that we have the right policies, but also the right resources available in other places. And I think I'll just conclude with a call to, or a question actually to Partha, if I may, on given the complexity of all of these issues and all of the assets and the relationship between all of these assets, if you could perhaps share with us what you think is the most useful way for academics to engage. Again, I do a little bit, I really would love your comments on that. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Laura. And our third discussant is a visitor to St. John's. He's a Beaufort Visiting Fellow this term, Professor Richard Lazarus, who is the Charles Stebbins Fairchild Professor of Law at Harvard University. He teaches and works in the area of environmental law and natural resources law, amongst the many things he does, but these are the two why we're particularly interested to hear from him today. He was the principal author of the Deepwater, the Gulf oil disaster and the future of offshore drilling report of 2011 after that disaster in America. We invite you up, Richard, to offer a few thoughts on what you've heard. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure for me to be here, participate in this event, and to be a Beaufort Visiting Fellow this term here at St. John's. I'm a professor of law, so I bring a very different disciplinary perspective to the climate issue than others. But what's so remarkable for me, however, is that notwithstanding that very distinct perspective, I actually focus on exactly the same things that Professor Dasgupta does in my work. What frames his work and his thinking here is exactly what frames my thinking on the legal issues. As an economist, you may have seen, Professor Dasgupta contends that there are three pervasive features of nature: its mobility, its invisibility, and its silence, that require a fundamental reformation in our thinking of the relationship between nature and our economy. In my own field of law, it's those exact same pervasive features of nature, which are the defining challenge of making climate law. The challenge presented by the laws of nature, human nature, and the nature of our lawmaking institutions, and the political friction generated by the collision of all three when one tries to make climate law. And the resulting susceptibility, at least in the United States, of that lawmaking system being captured, as Dr. King said, by powerful forces focusing on the here and now. First, as Professor Dasgupta stressed, there's nature's mobility, and that's both over time and space. He mentioned why it makes it hard to create property rights in aspects of nature like oceans or the atmosphere. Well, that's precisely what makes climate law so intractably hard. The science, indeed, the chemistry of climate change, as Dr. King knows better than anyone in this room, is defined by its mobility. Actions at one place have consequences at another place. Actions at one time have consequences at another time. The global, spatial, and temporal dimensions of climate change are enormous. It's not just miles, it's thousands of miles. It's not just minutes in being spread out, it's decades and centuries being spread out between cause and effect. The implications for climate lawmaking have proven devastating, especially in the United States. And I'm happy to say in conversation, not just for the Republicans. The Democrats haven't done so well either. We had Al Gore vice president, Bill Clinton as president in 1992. Al Gore had just written the book, Earth in the Balance, where he described climate change as an existential threat and no compromise should be made. And what did the Clinton-Gore group do for 8 years? Nothing. Nothing. For political reasons related to this. In the United States, and perhaps in any lawmaking system, it's exceedingly hard to get laws passed that regulate and impose costs on activities and people at one place or to benefit people and activities at another place. Very distant in space. It's very hard in the United States and maybe in any lawmaking system, except maybe in China, which doesn't have these kinds of concerns, to regulate activities at one time, people and activities impose costs at one time for the benefit of people and activities at a far distant time. Especially for those, when we're talking about the spread being thousands of miles and maybe 100 of years. Lawmakers in the United States are elected based on the desires of the here and now. The there and then don't vote. They're elected to 2 4-year election cycles, and their constituents are concerned with their own bounded geographic jurisdictions. And the here and now and voice in the United States, especially under our campaign policies, tend to be then even further dominated by those with economic power in the here and now. But it's not just the economically powerful. It's actually the people themselves in the United States care about the here and now, not so much the there and then. And this is where Professor Dasgupta's other 2 pervasive features of nature make climate lawmaking harder still. As he put it, nature's silence and its invisibility. People do not perceive climate change cause and effect. It's invisible to them. It is silent. The accumulating concentration in the atmosphere, they don't see it. And they don't understand how consuming too much gasoline, turning up the heat a little bit more in your house, turning on the air conditioning, burning a few more lights in your home, how that causes hurricanes, how that causes wildfires, how that causes in distant parts of the world famine and drought. It does, but people don't see it. It's not available, it's not presented to them in a time and spatial dimension that they readily appreciate. How it can cut down and shut down ocean currents, which will have catastrophic consequences. And how it can cause ultimately mass migrations of millions of climate refugees around the globe. It's hard for a lawmaking system. And here's the ultimate tragedy of climate change. The same 3 pervasive features of nature that require rethinking of how we should define our economy make it systematically hard to get the necessary laws passed to do that. Even while our brilliant climate chemists make it clear about the cause and effect better than they ever could before, and while we come up with more technological solutions to reduce greenhouse gases, nature is defeating our ability to make the laws necessary to make it happen. And the United States is making it hard to elect national leaders who wish to do so. And the current election in the United States makes that stark. It is, as Professor Dasgupta said, increasingly a house of cards. The stakes are enormous and growing, and time is short. Thank you.
I'm inviting Partha to respond, but I'm allowing him only 5 minutes, I'm afraid, Partha. And then if I could have a couple of volunteers, we may have a little time for Q&A. If a couple of people could come up the front and take a microphone each, one to the left and one to the right, that would be much appreciated. Thank you. Partha.
First of all, thank you very much for these. I'm deeply appreciative of these rich comments. I want to address a few of them because it's a natural extension of my talk. The key problem, the source of the problem that's been alluded to by the speakers is what we call externalities, which is to say, these are the unaccounted for consequences for others of our actions. Unaccounted means it's done without negotiation, so that the harm is inflicted on a person in the cases that I'm looking at now, which are adverse externalities rather than beneficial ones. Okay. Now, I gave you the impact inequality, and then in one of the parameters was alpha, the efficiency with which we transform provisional goods into final products. And one way of making things inefficient is global subsidies. You realize about $5 to $6 trillion per year of subsidies for natural capital, including energy subsidies, water subsidies, and so forth. So lifting those would be raising alpha in that formula, as it were, and therefore bringing on the demand. So that's one category of policies that we could be thinking of, because this is a self-inflicted wound. We think, of course, we are helping people, farmers and so forth, and that's true. But on the other hand, there's cheaper ways of doing it. They're not helping them that way by giving them a subsidy to do it, but give them cash transfers. So that's a huge area of public discourse that we should be having, but public finance people don't seem to be particularly interested in it. Now, externalities, I mentioned, is a cause for really appreciating the fact that using natural capital, export and import of natural capital involves externalities, has deep implications on our notion of trade, our approval of free trade. And at the period that I was growing up as an economist here, free trade has become dominant. The WTO supports it, the World Bank encourages it, our own governments encourage it. Now here's a problem with it. There are lots of benefits, but here are some problems. And it has to do with one of the points that were made about equity across nations. Typically, that's not entirely exactly universally correct, but typically we draw our primary products from the tropics, which also happen to house the rich biodiversity as well, and that's why we're getting the primary products from there, but it's also happened to be the seat of some of the poorest countries in the world. Now, when you demand affects an ecosystem in one particular region, then the detrimental externality that's caused by this excess demand transmits to a neighboring ecosystem in that same region. And when the primary product is exported to a rich country, let us say, that export price does not include that harm that the adjacent ecosystem has experienced, which means what? Translated, it means that the export carries with it an explicit subsidy. It's a transfer of wealth from the poor country to the rich country. Nobody notices it. In fact, they're encouraged to do that because, of course, you want to have more trade. So these are the insidious implications of externalities on economic activity we tend to forget. It's exactly right that it's pointed out that the powerful have an undue power over our futures, and we citizens are small. But at the end of the day, it is we citizens who suffer, and therefore we are responsible for our suffering because we need to act together. Now, here is a problem. Simple game theoretic reasoning tells us that if the benefits of collective action are non-excludable, and let's say the population, the costs and benefits of collective action are similar across people, then each person will wish to free ride on the collective activity of the others. Because the benefit I'll enjoy, I don't have to pay the cost. This simple game theoretic reasoning, which I suspect all the youngsters here, young people here will already have seen in their lecture courses, has very powerful implications as to why we all recognize there is a problem, but we don't do anything about it, because the incentive on the individual to actually join the crowd is hard. So you need some asymmetry. You need some low-cost, extremely dedicated, difficult people, as it were. They always be making a noise. You need something to trigger the mechanism by which collective action takes place. But it doesn't usually happen. And it explains why so much of the ills of the world go unattended to. We recognize it, we don't do it. It's nobody's actual fault, because after all, we have to raise children, or whatever, raise family and so forth. We have other things to do. Collective action is not costless. But this is one of the problems that we face. I think at the end of the day, some of the questions that have been, some of the observations that have been made, I'm increasingly convinced, and although in my own review, I've laid emphasis on that, on education. And the reason I placed emphasis on education, on nature studies, nature, to convert all of us into something like naturalists, the desirability of that, I came to that conclusion because of the reasons that just been emphasized, the silence of nature, the invisibility of nature, that at the end of the day, conservation requires self-discipline. What I do cannot be observed always by others, so that social norms of behavior or the law are both out of reach at the individual level. You go alone to a park, or to a garden, and the temptation to pick flowers from it is rather high. Nobody observes it, so you do it. And others do it too when they come along, and before you know what's happened, the garden has been spoiled. And we see that happening in springtime in the gardens that are open to the public in our neighborhood. I've seen that happen, and that's how it is. Now, how do you stop that? You do that only if we are educated to think that we care about this. We don't want to, a little bit of gratification can be withheld, if you like, by preserving. It's this self-discipline, I think, is at the heart of what we ought to be thinking of when we think of primary education. And one of the reasons I emphasized education of nature studies from the earliest stages of our students' life and extending through the years was precisely that if you, in some sense, it seems to me that the self-discipline comes if you care about that object, if you care about nature. And you care about nature, I think the more you care about nature, it'll happen if you understand the complexity of nature's processes. I've hung out the last 30 years with some of the world's great ecologists, so I think I know something about ecological processes. And the view you have when you see muck out there in the Gange, they're very beautiful. But they become very beautiful because you know what's going on in it there. And that science of it, the processes that are nurturing us or our lives, to get an appreciation of that seems to me to be at the heart of the problem that we're discussing. Now, there are quick solutions. As with everything, there are short-range things you can do, long-range. I'm now moving to the longest range, which is reform of our education system, which is also included in our review. But that's why the review is 600 pages long, and it's now being published by Cambridge University Press, and as the master will say, well, Partha can't leave that alone. So I added another 50 pages to the CUP version, but only because I wanted to add some material of interest, potential interest to graduate students and students here, which means some maths and some additional boxes and some special topics. But I think in some ways I like to see economics being taught through the eyes of ecology. And my book has been written in that version, and I've not produced a non-technical version on natural capital that Penguin will be publishing next summer. It's not a shortened version of my review, because that's 4 years old and my thoughts have evolved since then. But I think it's my idea of what I think economics is about. It's about asset management, but for sure. But it's particularly now about an asset we've been neglecting throughout, and not just economists, but the world at large. Okay. I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much, Partha. Well, time has moved on, rather. We've had some very excellent contributions here. I think because we said there would be, we'll have time for just one, perhaps two questions, depending on the length of the answers.
Take some questions at drinks.
Sorry?
I can also take questions when we meet.
Yes, we will go downstairs where there's wine and so on. So if you've got a specific question to one of these people, you might want to keep it for then. Otherwise, you're far quickest off the draw. Well done. And do say your name first, please.
Thank you. My name is Mariana Martinez del Rio. Thank you. This is amazing. I'm a big fan of yours, so it's great to be able to hear from you. My question would be, what do you think are the main challenges that a decision maker, let's say in the political system of a global south, if it's right to say it that way, faces to start making these changes, let's say in Colombia, Ecuador, or those countries? Like, you make them aware, and what do you think are the main challenges that they face?
Oh gosh, I couldn't presume to even nibble at your question, because I would know what to do. What I would say, okay, one thing we overlook is the amazing importance of what we academics do. Because today's decision maker was yesterday's student, and tomorrow's is today's student, okay? So what we do, maybe mathsy or whatever, but hell, there's a huge connection between public decision making and academic world. And it continues its toing and froing across the years, so that, don't forget, there is an alliance between the two, which is very, very strong. So what should they be doing? I think I would say the decision maker needs to re-educate himself if he's in the particular area of policy making in the economic field, because the economics he learned or she learned is totally bogus. It doesn't have natural capital in it. And I'm being forceful here for a very good reason. That's what I really believe. And I believe it. I'm trying to give evidence as to why we are missing out. An entire language that we have developed goes awry through that. It's extremely important to see that the evolution of a discipline takes place bit by bit, incremental. It's always incremental, because today's article in a magazine, in a journal, is built on yesterday's article, and day after's will be on tomorrow's article, and so forth. So we build on each other. So there's huge path dependence in this process. Errors that you make to begin with get enshrined in what happens in the future. Breaking that is hard work, and what we are discussing here is breaking that. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're looking at introducing an asset structure, which has been missing in and it has influenced our entire language, free trade. But free trade, we have a theorem which says free trade is good. But that theorem requires that every commodity has a competitive price. But we forget the conditions, but we notice the prescription. And of course, here, most of the prices are missing. That's why we are discussing natural capital. So it's always that which is under pressure. Next, the direction of technological change. We say we want technological advancement, but the incentive for technological change is guided by prices, price structure. Why should an entrepreneur economize on a commodity when he's investing on a commodity which is cheap? He's going to be economizing on something expensive. So we have labor-saving devices. We have capital-saving devices. We don't have nature-saving devices because she's cheap. So naturally, you want to be exploiting. So the entire drift of economic systems is directed against nature, let alone the marginal ones that follow. So I would say yes for the decision maker. He ought to do some reading to begin with, perhaps at the feet of some ecologists. No harm in that.
Would one of our panel particularly be bursting to offer an answer to this specific question? Otherwise, we'll move to a final question. Okay, final question over here. Yes.
I'm Prerna Bindra, and I would, well, I'll stick to one question, many in my mind. But you, in your lecture, mentioned something that we wrestle with because it's such an unexpected sort of dilemma, where a solution of renewable energy seems to be a problem because of the impacts it has on nature and biodiversity, not just in terms of the raw material of rare earth minerals, etc., but also the fact that they are very, say, solar energy or wind energy. It's very land intensive. It's very land intensive and is usually placed on the most biodiverse areas of the world. And just the concentration of the solution being only on renewable energy seems to be a problem that one faces on an everyday basis as far as biodiversity.
So concentration on what? That info?
Just this one sort of solution to climate change appears to be.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so which is something you touched on, which I'm very keen to know more about. How do you address this particular dilemma? Because you're questioning what is actually, it is a solution, but it also has a very huge impact on biodiversity. So to me, that's something which is a problem. I would like to know.
Well, maybe we could discuss this later. I'm not quite sure I followed exactly what you have in mind. If you're saying that if you concentrate on climate change, you might be messing up with elsewhere in the natural world, the answer is yes, absolutely right, and that's what I was trying to point out. You do need to, I mean, look, it's not an easy problem. In any case, no decision maker is solving the world's problems. The decision maker is solving some local problem that he or she has received at her desk, okay? And that kind of problem is amenable to an attack by the decision maker with the tools that he or she has, so long as she knows the language correctly. And the problem is that she doesn't at the moment. And that's why I was concentrating on the framing of the problem, the language with which we use for deciding on public. You see, no decision maker's got the global problem, the world's problems. It's always tiny bits. But every tiny bit needs to be anchored to the missing objects that is likely to be missed out. And so she should have to dig forward. So yes, I would say the decision maker needs reports, for example, feasibility studies. Feasibility studies now to be really redrawn much more carefully with regard to the implications of biodiversity, not just a little appendix, and there is an impact on nature. Okay, so that's a big deal. Now you have to give equal weight to that with the kind of evidence data that you require when it comes to labor cost, importer products and so forth and so on in the factory. It's that which is missing. I've seen lots of feasibility reports of projects in India and in this country, in India in particular. That's when I used to work on these problems there. And there was never any mention of natural capital.
Thank you, Partha. And that question seems to have provoked two of our panelists to very quickly say something.
Let me quickly say this. Renewable energy in China has produced 50% of their electricity today. In just 12 months, things happen very quickly in China. In 12 months, 2023, June to 2024, they introduced 300 gigawatts of solar energy, which is all driven in arid areas that cannot be used for farming. Right, so what I'm saying is China's doing extremely well. This country, I'm very proud of this, we've stopped using coal to make electricity, principally because we went offshore and used offshore wind. And the offshore wind, frankly, is not impacting on the biodiverse world. We're producing more than 50% of our electricity today from that offshore wind. So what we can do is make this transition and do it carefully without destroying our biodiverse systems.
Thank you, David. Laura?
Not much to add. I just wanted to say that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, does have as one of its main conclusions, and I'm also a lead author of that, so a disclaimer, that one of the things we can do now is carefully decarbonize electricity and electrify as much as we can. And those things that we cannot electrify, invest in some of these other options that we need to develop. But yes, you're completely right, we need to do it carefully, but that's one thing we can do now that is already resulted in 18 countries globally over at least 10 years, even looking at trade, looking at consumption-based emissions, 10 years in a row, emissions going down. It's mainly through the decarbonization of the power sector, but it needs to be done carefully.
Richard,
And I agree completely. It needs to be done carefully, but it needs to be done quickly.
Yep.
That's where we don't have the luxury. And it helps a lot to be careful and slow and deliberative. With climate, we just don't have the time to be careful, slow, and deliberative.
Thank you.
Yep.
So